I will say right now, I'm going to be giving you a lot of information on obviously copyright basics, so I'm going to give you a good foundation of just facts I know about copyright. I'm not a lawyer, I don't have any ability to give legal advice on anything, but this is my understanding of facts of copyright to give you a basis of information that you can use and apply to different work in libraries, as well as information that's going to help you supplemental to the presentations later on the line of the workshop series. Let's see, with that, to start it, I actually want to start out doing something a little different from what I normally see in workshops. I'd like to ask you guys a question. What is copyright? Any thoughts or ideas? Yes?
It's like copyright, the legal ownership of an idea or like an object or kind of a creation.
Intellectual property.
That's part of it, yeah. My favorite one, which I've heard before, and I like even guys, it's the right to make copies is a lot I've heard in the past, which is one of my favorite answers, which is also not entirely wrong. So what copyright is actually a bundle of rights. And these rights are designed to, like you guys mentioned, protect your ownership of a creation, whether it's a published work or unpublished work, and give you a limited monopoly on it, as well as promote the progress of science and useful arts. And in a way, these are sort of complementary and conflicting. The interesting thing is a bit about the limited monopoly. So you do have protection of your rights, or any entity that creates something has protection of what they have created. But with the whole promotion of science and useful arts, there are certain situations where the copyrights can be not quite circumvented, but does not stand. Things like libraries, for example, how we are able to provide. We're not exempt from all copyrights, but we do have special exemptions. So it's not all about just the protection of the rights for that person so they can make money. There's also this whole aspect of trying to promote information and knowledge amongst the community. Another question that I hear a lot are, what are my copyrights? So what does this bundle do? What is part of this bundle of rights? In your copyrights, you have the right to reproduce works or make copies of that work. You are able to create derivative works, which means works that come from the original works, whether they're a continuation of what the original work was or just something that in some way utilizes the source material of the original works. You're allowed to do that. You're allowed to publicly distribute works, whether it's by sale or just a transfer of your rights to someone else or to some other entity, like publishing agreements. That's something you're allowed to do. And one that we don't always think of in libraries is you have the right to publicly perform or display. This is usually more when thinking like an art piece or a play or some sort of music, but that is another one of your rights. I use the term bundle of rights because your copyrights are indeed bundled together. You have all those rights I mentioned before, and when you're transferring those rights or when you're giving over those rights to somebody else for whatever reason, it can be done all the rights at once or just certain rights. This is a big thing that comes up in libraries and universities when we have professors who are publishing an article or going to a publishing entity, and they're saying, hey, I want to publish through you. They give them their article, and there's a misconception that when they do that, they're just giving the right to reproduce works and sell works. They don't realize that by doing this, they might be giving up their own ability to do so, their own ability to make profits off it or to give it to transfer it to anyone else. So it's good to very much read through and carefully look over what the contracts are, what rights you're giving up, what rights a faculty member is giving up when they are signing these agreements. Again, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to let me know. This is just a little chart that's a brief little history of copyright as it relates to the U.S. So copyright first, or at least our history of copyright, really starts up with the statute of Queen Anne, which says that when you create something or publish something, you have to register it with a copyright office or copyright entity, and you have, I don't know if it's called copyright office for England to be perfectly honest, but you have that copyright for 14 years, Once those 14 years are up, you'll have to re-register. Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Precious give me.
No, it's perfectly fine. In fact, I'm going to do this for you really quick, just so you can sign in. So I keep running my own. Absolutely. Well, basically, the statute man says that you have these 14 years. When they're up, you have to re-register, and you have to keep doing that every 14 years. It's a little tedious, but it made sense and it worked for the time. And that bled over into what our copyright laws were after the U.S. was formed, Constitution was created. Later, when copyright laws started getting more heavily discussed, we were heavily influenced by that a lot. And then we started branching off with our own cases and our own unique situations regarding copyright. So, as I mentioned, the statute of Anne. The first big one was in 1841, which is Folsom versus Marsh. So in this case, Folsom versus Marsh, there's basically a work that was published by Folsom which is a publishing group, not the original author, which was a 12-volume series that was the biography of George Washington. And Marsh actually took about 353 pages worth of material from that to publish their own work, their own derivative work from that. So Folsom sued Marsh saying, you've used our intellectual property and you can't do that, we're suing you for taking money. And Marsh's defense was, we can do this because this is just facts about George Washington, you didn't do anything creative. In the end, Marsh lost the case. Folsom won, but it actually made a very interesting beginning for fair use, or the decision on what fair use is, because the reason they won is the Supreme Court decided, A, it needed to be fair use, it would have to be a limited use. They used way too much, way more than they needed to use to make this work. Second of all, it needs to be a transformative purpose. The biography that was created by Marsh was meant to sell and make money and therefore take profits away from the biography created by Folsom, and it used a lot of the material that it had already creatively put together. And this word creatively put together comes into play a lot more with copyright later down the line. So it's important to remember that, and it meant that their claim that facts cannot be copyrighted was not going to cut it for them. Moving on a good over 100 years, we have the Copyright Act of 1976. So earlier I mentioned when you have something that you create, you have to register it with a copyright office, otherwise it's not considered yours, there's no copyright protection for you. The Copyright Act got rid of that. It said as soon as you've created something tangible, then you have copyright claim to that item, to that creation. Instead of every 14 years of re-registering, you have till the death of the person who created it plus 70 years. That's how long that item is under copyright for, has copyright protections for. If it's a group of author, it's 70 years after the last living author's life. If it was created by some sort of institution or organization, it is 95 years after it was published, or 120 years after it was created if it wasn't published in any certain way. This I find kind of interesting, and it's going to bleed in more to some of the other presentations throughout the month of the Know Your Copyright series, which is the Sony case. So, you know, a lot of you, especially back in like the VHS era, have seen the whole thing. It's like if you copy this show, or if you tape this on a VHS or whatever many copies, it'll be illegal for XYZ. So the Sony case actually considered fair use for people who would record TV shows that have aired for the reason of time shifting. And the reason why is time shifting is a term for, so I missed this episode of Friends that aired, I'm dating myself because Friends like 15 years old, but this episode of Friends I really wanted to see because it's the season premiere, so I had my DVR or whatever, just record it when it played so I can watch it later. You're not going to take it and make a bunch of copies and sell it to other people. Like with this episode of Friends, other people to personal use. So time shifting is just taping something so you can watch it later because you missed the initial airing. So, and then there's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which basically is all about DRMs, digital rights management. What the DMCA does is it makes criminal any sort of technology or device that is used to circumvent DRMs. And what DRMs are, they're electronic. I'm trying to think of the exact specifics because I've used it before, or I've talked about it before, but basically they're what control or allow access to copyrighted materials electronically. There's definitely a lot more to it than that that I can't think of off the top of my head, sadly, but it will be discussed in future ones. I also didn't want to get too far into it because if you guys are going to be here for more series, I didn't want to jump in all over someone else's presentation by going to DRMs for the rest of this. I mentioned earlier, by the way, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to interrupt me. This isn't going to be something where I'm just talking at you the whole time. You have to hold your questions, so feel free to jump in whenever. Next, also on that same little timeline earlier, I can't go back good, is the TEACH Act. A lot of you have probably heard of the TEACH Act before, are probably familiar with the TEACH Act. One of the big things that it allows for is the ability to teach or to showcase copyrighted work face-to-face with an in-person setting, as well as some more specific electronic settings, but it allows you to showcase a work that will be copyrighted to a large audience, which is sort of that public performance thing, without any legal repercussions to yourself because you're using it for educational purposes and you're not distributing copies, you're just showcasing this item in a controlled setting. What the TEACH Act also allows for is for nonprofit institutions like universities and libraries, educational institutions to utilize materials and make copies and distribute copies of them, provided that they meet certain criteria. These criteria involve creating policies that are in line with copyright law. So you're going to have, your organization would have to create some sort of policies that showcase how, which is part 3, showcase how what it's doing is in line with copyright law and why these policies exist. Number 4, you'll have to have it be printed out in discoverable by the students of this is in compliance with copyright law because it was done by these measures. And what number 5 basically says is, and also let the student know that because we made copies and gave them to you doesn't mean that you can make copies and give it to whoever else, whether for profit or not. So that's what the TEACH Act did, which allows us, again, to showcase copyrighted work, but not necessarily openly distribute or have some further impact on the market. So the next question is, what falls under copyright? We talked earlier about the Folsom versus Marsh case, and they're saying that, well, you've taken our creative ideas or creative work. So copyright protects original creative expressions of work. By that I mean it's something that you have created that's not necessarily never been done before, but this expression of these facts, this idea is done in a way that is unique to you, or the purpose is unique for the reason you have made it. It also has to be a fixed, tangible medium of expression. So it has to be something you can see, you can hear, you can experience through this medium that I want to say that everyone can experience equally, but I feel then you get into the idea of like what art is, and then we'll get into this entire philosophical discussion about how everyone experiences art. But basically it's this actual thing, whether it's a sound recording, whether it is a score sheet of music, whether it's a book, whether it's a movie or a play, it's a fixed, tangible medium. What it does not protect, and this was what Marsh was trying to make the case for, is facts. Objective facts that are just, this is what it is. You can't protect that. You can't protect things that are just information that exists and is true. It also doesn't protect ideas. So if you're like, I have an idea for this thing, but I haven't yet created it, I haven't yet made it, you can't copyright the fact that you were the first one to think of what it is without making it so. See, I have an idea for, off the top of my head, I have an idea for a cure for cancer. So if a cure for cancer is ever made, I get copyright to it. That's not a thing you can do. You would have to go about making the cure, making sure it works, all that.
Question.
Yes. Thank you.
But when it says new expression, is it referring to the same expression we use in metadata standards? Or
Can you elaborate on that?
like, I think it's the book, right?
Right.
The expression I think would be the story, so it's not like copies of item, it's covering the story so you can read the copies.
It doesn't really align with Ferber very well, if that's what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, I guess so.
No, Ferber came like a long time after
Right.
this like use of expression, like in the code legal code.
Mhm.
So they're just talking about, yeah, I mean, I guess conceptually it's related, but like not a one-to-one correlation. So yeah, an expression in this case would be like not the work, like the sort of, Alice in Wonderland, but like the particular version or edition of that, particular telling of that story set in a fixed form. That's, written or audio or
Yes, I wasn't quite sure because you were being said. I thought you were asking. It's like is metadata.
I guess I was asking if the definitions were the same.
Not quite in Lincoln's instance because this is all stuff that hasn't just caught up to that level of technology and expression yet.
What are
So
the, like the different categories in
Item, manifestation, expression, and work.
they might have taken an expression essentially
You think so?
from this. It's quite possible, yeah. So that
Yeah.
might be more or less the same thing.
yeah, I can see that. I mean, the idea of expression because when we were talking when I think expression it means this exact version of a book or a film, anything like that. So it comes into just what has been created in this unique way and how much of it is creatively original thought. Like there's, in a lot of senses.
So looking at the definitions, it seems like there, Ferber OCLC defines expression as like the intellectual or artistic realization of a work, which is they distinguish from the manifestation, which is the physical embodiment. And so really I think it would still work because like what's copyrighted is like the manifestation. So an expression of a work could be manifested in like 1,000 or 100,000 copies of that work. And what's copyrighted is like the expression of the work itself. Not, I mean, each of the individual manifestations would be subject to copyright protection as well. But yeah, no, it seems to align correctly.
Good question. Yeah, no, thank you. I just put in something, which is always kind of nice. Yeah, the next bit that I was going to, where I left off, is that's around it. Is work created by federal agencies. So if there's something that's created by a government or government publishing office, more often, yeah, if it's published in the government publishing, it's definitely going to be in the public domain. You can use it. Down here, actually, there's a link that I can provide, which is fantastic, which is something that shows you what some of these instances are, these differences in local states and governments by state. Let's see if I can get to that. There we go. So you're able to click on any of the states and it'll give you that information on the states. By the way, part of the sign-in process for the emails, I do plan on emailing these slides, so you don't have to worry about quickly scribbling a URL, which would just make me, in my opinion, a terrible human being to do to you. So I will be sending these slides at the end of the lecture. Presentation, whichever word you'd like to use. Let's get back into the slides. Apparently I will not. So used to doing Google Slides now. To just start on slideshow? No. Yes. Good. There we go. And lastly, copyright is not protected by anything that is no longer covered by the time period. like I said with the author, if it's some author work and the author has died, is 7 years past when his date of death, and he hasn't bequeathed his copyrights to somebody else in any way, then it is now public domain. This is just a quick list that I like to give of just different examples that we don't always think of or see when we're discussing what's copyrighted in libraries, because a lot of times we're very used to published works, we're used to maybe films. Sometimes musical works if you work in a music library, of course, if you're anything specialized to these, but things that I don't think of a lot are, you know, sculptures, architectural works, sound recordings I don't always think of, and pantomimes. Like, these are just things that we don't always consider. So it's just good to remember that things that fall under copyright is more than just a book or an ebook. Okay, I'd like to use this time to actually show you this little video of the Feist case. Were you raising your hand?
No.
Okay, just making sure. Yeah. But of the Feist case, which gives me a chance to slip in a sip of water, and also gives you guys a chance to hear something besides me talking at you for a bit. So it's also a very, I think, a very great summation of a case that's really important to copyright. So. Everyone read that okay? Song back here stuck in your head yet? Yeah. Yeah, I just didn't have a lot of male cartoon records. So, video, like, in the sense of animation, then the looping music is a little silly, but one thing I do like, I should also preface, this is by UNC Libraries. They have a lot of these videos, and they're really great about using very plain language to help better understand rather complex copyright concepts. So it's a nice little tool, and I fully support them creating them and then making them publicly available like this. Let's get back to this. So the interesting thing about the Feist case is basically it ruled that the facts that were being copied, which were phone numbers from the white page listings, were not original material, and they were not overly creatively organized, which is kind of the flip side of the Folsom versus Marsh case from earlier, which is saying that your collection of, the fact that you were collecting facts was creatively put together, so it is defended by copyright. So there's a different level. There's this other thing I mentioned earlier of creativity. Level of creativity and how it's organized is fairly important, and what you're deriving from it, the amount of facts, what is just straight facts, and what you're actually taking from a creative interpretation is very different, very important when deciding whether something is protected by copyright or not, or what you're able to take from the work. And that gets into another interesting point with libraries, which is what is copyright for some of the materials we create. Granted, with libraries, we're usually a lot more, not always, but we're usually a lot more open with wanting to make what we create more available to the public. But things like indexes, catalog records, table of contents, all these things, these are collections of facts. So what would be the copyright there? I'm not saying there's going to be a huge case about this soon, but at the same time, it's just something to keep in mind of what that could possibly mean. So in this, we mentioned fair use of it. There are other exceptions besides fair use to the whole bundle of rights of when copyright will not protect use of the work and does not require you to pay a fee for the work or go through some other means of acquiring ownership of that work. One is compulsory licenses, and that's when the government decides that whatever this work is, someone else or the public can use it simply because the government decides that, or just says so. They step in, they say this is going to be something that is publicly useful, this is something that anyone can access or utilize, or this is something this particular person can because of X, Y, and Z reasons. So that's something to keep in mind. Another one is just exemptions in general. There's a couple of exemptions. There's actually, exemptions are written within the Constitution itself. First is, again, this fair use, which is Section 107. Section 108, which will be covered a lot more extensively here in, I believe, next week's new copyright presentation, which is libraries have special exceptions that they don't have to abide by copyrights under certain criteria. This covers a lot of things. ILL and library loans are even mentioned in these laws. Our ability to archive and preserve things, to make duplicates of specific items for the use and purposes of education, preserving knowledge, is all covered in that. it doesn't address, and this is true for, I feel this will almost always be true for law, it doesn't address as much about modern technology, since modern technology is always evolving with what's modern, and it's doing its best to amend and keep up with that. So there will probably be more laws, more, that's where I'm looking for, amendments made along the way, but for right now there are certain technologies that are not entirely addressed. There's also the first sale doctrine. First sale doctrine basically says if you as an individual buy the item, then that item you now have copyright over. Doesn't mean you have copyright to every other item like it, just that item, which makes things particularly odd and weird when it comes to the digital, where when you buy something, it's not too difficult to copy it, which going back to the DRMs that we mentioned earlier, the digital rights management systems, those are technologies prevent you from copying, prevent you from distributing. But originally, first sale document was the idea of I bought this thing, I now can do whatever I want, I can give someone else, I can sell it to someone else, but it's just one copy. Yes, sir?
With just one copy.
Yeah, just one copy, yes.
That's the thing.
Mhm, yeah. And then section 110, which we also mentioned earlier, is part of the chapter, was a face-to-face teaching for nonprofit reasons. A face-to-face teaching environment, you can use, again, one copy or some copies of a copywritten work, choose a class for them to use for that reason of education, for their learning. Okay, so this is a fun food for thought. This is from the 2014 Oscars. It was a selfie picture that got a lot of airtime run around on Twitter and other social media. And I don't know who had the idea of it originally, and I know the story behind this basically Ellen DeGeneres wanted to take this selfie. I don't know if someone else has mentioned it, if it's her idea, and her arms were not long enough to get everyone the picture. Being the person with freakishly long arms, I know what being Bradley Cooper's like, where it's like, hey, can you use your freakishly long arms to take this picture of all of us? And being the guy with the freakishly longest arms, of course, of course. So the question here, it's a bit of food for thought, is who owns, if someone for whatever reason wants to say, this is my picture, who owns the copyright to this picture? Just off the top of your head.
Copyright owner? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's actually, he's actually right. It's actually the person who took the picture, unless it was a work for hire, which will be mentioned more later on, but that's more of if someone hires you to create something, they, as long as contracts and all the legalities are in place, that they would own copyright of the thing that you made because they paid you to make it. So, assumedly, Ellen didn't slip them $5 to take a picture of everyone all at once, but if she did, she might have a legal claim if this ever for some reason became a case. But yeah.
I might have paid him in pizza.
I mean, that is the usual method of currency for selfies, as far as I'm aware. Very good, by the way. So there are 4 ways to own a copyright. You can be the author, creator of the copyright. Of course, that's the easiest one, the most sensible one. This came out a lot smaller than I meant it to. I apologize for anyone who might have to squint. You can transfer the rights by written agreement, those publisher agreements. You can be that somebody else in a will. So when you die, the copyright of said item goes on to that person. And then there's state agency laws, which is that if, well, I shouldn't say you, but if the copyright owner dies and they do not have anyone in their will to say who gets it, the state can decide to give copyright to someone else or some other entity or organization for, again, whatever reason. Are you raising your hand? Yeah.
Actually, yeah. If you get a copyright bequeathed to you, is that for 70 years past the life of the person who bequeaths it
Yes,
to you?
that is correct. As far as yeah, no, that is correct, yes. You get it for it's your lifetime plus 70 years. You are then now the creator, the rights holder of it. So that is correct, I believe, yes.
So it still tolls on the basis of the creator's life,
Mm-hmm.
but you own the copyright to it, so you are
So until
you're
you're
the copyright holder. The term of the copyright doesn't change.
right.
On the basis of who controls it.
Aaron is actually a lawyer, so when I said earlier I can't give legal advice, I look for my advice from Aaron. So, thank you. So earlier we mentioned how copyright needs to be registered, or needed to be registered back with the statute of Anne. It doesn't anymore in the sense of a necessity, but it is actually still something you can do, and it's actually a very good idea if it is something you plan to be making any money off of, or you very much feel might be a contention in a court of law at some point, to register it. You can do that with the Copyright Office. There's a lot of pluses to registering. The biggest one, of course, is now you have a legal, physical document saying, yes, I own this item, I own this creation, it is mine. Another plus, which is more just a plus of the process, it doesn't cost too much. If it's for a larger company, obviously, some sort of, whether it's creation of the company owns it, they just really want to make sure that all language is right for anything they might have to take on a lawsuit. Lawyers' fees aren't too much for it, but more often than not, just having it is enough to deter any sort of legal action against you. And I know self-registering is like $25-50 for something you've created with the Copyright Office. It's really not too expensive if you feel this might come under attack by somebody else who wants to say, no, we own it, or if they're trying to take it from you. And registers work with customs. So if it ever becomes an issue of international copyright law, which gets a lot hairier and trickier, you already have something on your side of, I own this and it's timestamped to this time, so you have that information. I also briefly want to mention orphan works. So we're talking a lot about, here's this work that the author dies, or here's this work of how long does it last. What happens when the copyright owner can't be identified? The author can't be reached somehow, or the next of kin. There's just this discussion, confusion, and a lot of gray area of no one knows who owns the copyright. Does that make it public domain? If you can't find or contact the copyright owner, can't discover who it is?
Would it be like the owner of the item or object?
Right. Well, not even the owner of the item or object, just in general yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. No, that's true. That's a good point to say. But in the U.S., yeah. It would make an orphan work, which basically puts it in this weird sort of copyright limbo. It just makes it so you can't really use it and you can't really get permission for it. So it gets really hairy, nice, and confusing. And I'd like to say there's a very simple and easy answer to that, or there's this one authority you immediately go to. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't. Again, I'm looking over here and it's like maybe he knows you read legal cases for fun, so you're always much more up to date if something has happened. Like, by the way, yesterday, Mackenzie. But yeah, to the best of my knowledge, it's just a mess, and it's something that's being dealt with. And actually, I believe, are you talking about hefty trust in yours?
In my presentation?
Yes.
I probably will.
Okay, so you might hear more if you go to Aaron's, which will be, I believe, the fourth in the workshop series. It's a lag on this. This is a slide I'm mostly adding to say the point that it's good to read the statutes of what our rights are in copyright and what different instances of copyright provide for. So this is letting you know the first 8 chapters of Title 17 address a lot of copyright. There's a lot of standalone. This is sui generis. It just means sort of standalone, unique amendments to it that come in the next couple of chapters. But this will once again be emailed to you, and it has this hyperlink, which, I'm going to jump out really quick, takes us back to this, the copyright law of the U.S., which is publicly available. You can look through, you can read through it, you can make your own assessment and self-knowledge from there. Again, if you're at a point of legal concern, it's obviously better to get a lawyer or someone who's very, very skilled and qualified in reading the law. But still, this will give you a better understanding of any questions you might have, or maybe later down the road you might think of it, have this link and be able to go through and just check where you might stand or where your institution might stand. And let's say I want to go back to the whole international copyright law. So in the U.S., we mentioned there's copyright of the lifetime of the author plus 70 years, or if it's transferred to somebody else till the end of their lifetime, maybe bequeath to somebody else after that, maybe, let's say, instancy laws come in, wherever it goes there. But traditionally, it's the creator plus 70 years for an individual. That's not the same throughout other countries. Everything I've given you today is as much as I can tell you about U.S. copyright law. In other places, Spain, it's a life plus 80 years. In Mexico, it's a life plus 100 years. So what happens in a situation where the author of a piece in Mexico has been dead for about 78 years and you want to use it in America? Traditionally, it's going to be default to Mexico's laws more often than not. It's still, again, when it comes to legalities, everything could be argued, but as far as I know, it would default to the country of origin and their laws. But international law is always terrifying to me, and I can't explain it in greater detail than that. There are rules for copyright, like I said, rules for copyright, confidence range. Another link is this, which will take you to this public domain chart. So if you're trying to wonder whether something falls in the public domain or not, through any of the modes of expression I mentioned earlier, you can go to Peter Earle's chart. I'm sorry that these transitions take a while for me to be able to see this, but which is this, which shows you just a sort of like nice little flowchart of different works, when they are created, what the rules are on them, whether they fall in public domain or not. You have, I could go through all this, but I don't want to use up the entire rest of the lecture. The other point of a lot of these hyperlinks and things are also just give you all resources at the end of this, so you'll have something you can easily go back to and look to instead of just forcing yourself to memorize all of it. There's a few rules of thumb when it comes to public domain in the U.S. Sorry about that. Current slide. One is that if it's been published before 1923 in the United States, it is in the public domain now. And the second, as I mentioned earlier, anything published before or after that date abroad in other countries is going to be not necessarily under public domain, depending on what that country's laws are. The last thing I want to show you is, and send you with, is the copyright fair use checklist. Is anyone familiar with the fair use checklist? Have you guys seen this before? So the fair use checklist is divided into 4 sections of when you're looking over something you want to use it or use a part of. In libraries, once again, when we see a lot of like films or articles, how much you can use. I use this a lot actually as the research specialist. Like this is my baby. This is my go-to. And it's divided into these 4 different uses, or these 4 different criteria. First is a purpose and characteristic of the use. So whether it's being used for something that is making profit or it's not, whether it's educational, whether the character is transformative of what the original, or how you're using it is different from what the original point was. I'm trying to think of a good example of that off the top of my head. So transformative use is a weird statement. A lot of people think when they hear transformative use, the entire thing just needs to be different. Like what you are using is just a different. Good?
Can I give an example?
Yeah, go for it, please. You have one off the top of your head.
So like one of the classic examples of transformative fair use in the academic, like higher education environment, is just like your average art history research paper, where you're taking, in many cases, like, you know, a full copyrighted work.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're studying modern art, and you want to take like this painting and craft like a whole treatise around it.
Right.
And so originally, like, the artist created that for a specific purpose, you know, as art, and you know, maybe to display in a gallery or what have you. But your use as like a researcher in taking that and putting it in your paper and crafting an argument around it is highly transformative, because you're using it for a completely different purpose, and for a different audience, and,
Right.
and you're, you know, using it as sort of like impetus for like the creation of new knowledge.
Right.
Provided that you're, you know, devoting substantial criticism and commentary to that work. But you're taking it out of its original context, using it for a different reason, you know, saying different things about it, and you're doing all of that for like a different audience. So all of those things, I think, weigh in favor of transformative
Yeah.
So if it's a born digital object,
Yes.
would transformative count as saving it to another file format or cropping? Like if it's a photo.
That's where the confusion is. You think transform, you think if I just change sort of like, this is weird, change what it is instead of changing what its purpose is or what I'm using it for, and that wouldn't necessarily change that. I can't imagine it would.
So there's some really interesting stuff we'll get into in the fair use workshop about that specifically, because the Google Books and Trust cases sort of invented or brought about the creation of a new term in the copyright fair use pantheon, for lack of a better word, but non-consumptive fair use. The idea that if you're taking Google Books Trust, they were making available short snippets of things, but not in a way that they were doing large scale copying on the back end and doing OCR, digitizing, doing OCR, and making that text searchable in an index, but not for the purposes of allowing people to actually consume that material. You could get access to a snippet or a short couple of pages, but it's not a substitute for the work itself. You couldn't read an entire novel that way. You only get access to a certain bit amount, and it's also highly transformative because you're using new technology to allow people to leverage new technology to do things that we never even contemplated before. And so, I don't think just converting something to another file format in itself is necessarily transformative, but when you take into account all of those broader factors and you're using it for the purpose, to enable new kinds of research and scholarship, for instance, what they're trying to do in market trust, making sort of few text and data mining, but without actually having access to the full text itself, and that could be very useful.
I was waiting for you to get all of them in one fell swoop. You actually just went straight from purpose to nature of the work, which is, again, you're saying there's difference between nature of making an online versus trying to educate, or whether it's something published or unpublished. The amount that you use is very important. You hear a lot about the rule, or it's often said as a whole 10% to one chapter rule, which is not a rule, by the way. It's a guideline. It's something that we sort of follow by, but legally there is no set percentage. It goes a lot more back into the whole transformative purpose. And one of the big ones that we hear a lot, which makes sense, is the effect on the market, is how much your creation is going to impact any sort of financial gain that the initial work receives. In the sense of reserves, which again is what is the more common thing I deal with, that basically means when I'm taking an article, not quite an article, usually marked on a book, I can't just post the entire thing on, because the professor thinks that under the Teach Act they're allowed to provide their students this entire book online completely so everyone can read it for what they need. I'm able to give them certain amounts. It's so easy to access and so easy to circumvent the lock that they log in to copy. They can easily copy a PDF I put on or anything like that, that I can give them a certain percentage, or I choose to do a certain percentage of the book by that rule of thumb. I give them a certain amount. I make sure it is because they're trying to deliver that information, those facts to the students, and it's not going to in some way diminish the market value of the original book that's still on the shelves and being sold, because that's where a lot of the legal issues come into play. Another thing, which I believe is the last link I have, is that same thing at the bottom there. If all this seems very abstract and weird, the fairly used checklist hits each of those points right here. So I was talking about when we were mentioning there's teaching versus for profit or entertainment. You hear a lot about parody law, things like that. If it's used for parody or criticism or commentary versus just having it for entertainment in some way. Nature is published versus unpublished. The factual comes back in, facts versus fiction, because fiction is more of a creative element. The amount, what part, not the amount, again, it's not just how much you use, but my favorite thing is whether it's appropriate for the educational purpose. Like that's the main thing is are these things, what you're using, very important to the exact thing you're trying to teach or provide in the sense of a knowledge base, and of course the effect is fairly obvious. And one thing that may not be is how many copies you make, is again why a lot of the things that the Teach Act and everything else copyright law says, here's this one copy for sales, that one copy, and you're not able to make more, because if you're making, if for example you got the DVD box set of, gosh, I can't think of the series. What? Game of Thrones, there you go. The box set series Game of Thrones. You just decide, for whatever reason, you have the ability to just make thousands of copies, and you're going to just give them for free, or just put it all online somewhere. Like that will destroy, not destroy the market, but definitely, for lack of a better word, piss them off something furiously, and then that will be a big legal issue because you brought them up a lot of money they could be making. I believe. And that is it. So thank you for sharing your time with me. Again, I will be sending these slides to you for you to look over anytime you want. And Ms. Mackenzie, if you have any questions for me, feel free to email me. I will answer to the best of my abilities. If I don't know it, I will research to my best of my abilities. If I still don't know it, I will find someone who does know the answer for you and get you in contact with them. So, thank you.